Grief has a way of revealing the quiet mathematics of a family. At 67, I had learned that every relationship eventually balances itself, kindness against memory, loyalty against time. But I had not expected the reckoning to arrive during my wife's funeral. It was Thursday, November 14th, in Halifax, just after 2:10 p.m. The wind off the harbour carried that cold Atlantic bite that settles into your coat sleeves and refuses to leave. The chapel doors at Snow's funeral home opened and closed in slow rhythm as friends stepped outside for air. Inside, the faint scent of lilies hung in the room like unfinished sentences. My wife, Margaret Elaine Whittaker, had been gone for exactly 4 days. I remember standing beside the polished oak casket, running my fingers across the smooth edge of the program cards. The paper felt stiff and cool. Across the room, my granddaughter Emily Whittaker, 9 years old, held a small stuffed fox Margaret had given her the previous Christmas. Then someone cleared her throat behind me. A careful sound. Deliberate. When I turned, my mother-in-law, Patricia and Delaney, stood there with a leather folder tucked under her arm. Her pearl earrings caught the light from the chapel window. She didn't lower her voice. "David," she said evenly, "we need to discuss the $38,000 you still owe this family." For a moment, the room went strangely quiet. Even the air felt thinner. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock near the organ. "Patricia," I replied softly, "this is Margaret's funeral." Her expression didn't move. That debt didn't disappear just because my daughter died. A few people nearby turned their heads. My colleague Raj Mehta, who had worked beside me for 23 years at Halifax Dominion Credit Union, shifted uncomfortably beside the aisle. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. Instead, I looked at Patricia's folder. It was thick, organized, prepared. And in that moment I realized something impossible. My wife and I had kept our finances meticulously documented for 42 years. Every mortgage payment, every loan, every receipt down to the last $14.73 pharmacy purchase. There was no such debt. But here's what I didn't know then. The envelope my lawyer would open exactly 60 days later, at 9:30 a.m. on Tuesday, January 14th, would prove something far worse than a lie. It would prove Patricia Delaney had been waiting years for Margaret to die. And the truth inside that envelope would cost her far more than $38,000. It would cost her everything she believed she could quietly take from me. At 67 years old, routine had become my quiet form of stability. I lived in the same narrow brick townhouse on Chestnut Street in the Hydrostone district of Halifax, a house my wife Margaret and I purchased on May 3, 1987, for exactly $92,600. The floors still creaked in the same places. The kitchen window still rattled slightly when the Atlantic wind pushed down the street. I had grown used to those sounds. They reminded me the structure was still standing. For 42 years, I worked as a senior forensic auditor at Halifax Dominion Credit Union. People think auditing is about numbers. It isn't. It's about patterns. A misplaced decimal here. A repeated vendor payment there. Money leaves footprints the same way people do, quietly, but consistently. That was the professional metaphor I carried through life. If something doesn't reconcile, the truth is somewhere in the ledger. Margaret used to smile whenever I said that. "David," she would laugh, stirring her tea at exactly 7:15 every morning, "you even audit the grocery receipts." The kitchen smelled faintly of toasted rye bread and the citrus cleaner Margaret preferred, Sunlight Lemon, always the same brand. "Someone has to maintain the records," I would answer. Across the table, my granddaughter Emily Whittaker sometimes sat swinging her feet against the chair legs. "Grandpa counts everything," she once whispered conspiratorially to Margaret. I pretended not to hear. Margaret passed away on Sunday, November 10th, at 3:42 a.m., inside QEII Health Sciences Center. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Diagnosis to goodbye in 9 months and 11 days. The house felt different afterward. Not empty exactly. Just quieter in a way that had weight. But here's what I didn't know then. The same skill that had uncovered $214,860 in internal embezzlement during my final year at the credit union would soon be pointed somewhere far more personal. And the ledger I was about to audit was my own family. There was one thing I had never mentioned to Patricia Delaney. Not once in 39 years of marriage. A small financial structure Margaret and I had built quietly, piece by careful piece, starting back in 1994. Not a secret exactly. Just something we had never needed to explain. At least, not until the day Patricia demanded $38,000 beside her daughter's casket. Generosity, like compound interest, grows slowly over time. At least that's how I used to think about it. For most of my marriage to Margaret, helping her family felt natural. Patricia Delaney had raised 3 children alone after her husband passed away in 1978, and I respected the endurance that required. She was organized, meticulous, and, in fairness, fiercely protective of her family. But protection and entitlement can begin to resemble each other after enough years. The first time money entered the conversation was Monday, March 12, 2001, just after 6:40 p.m. We were sitting around Patricia's dining table in Halifax, the smell of baked haddock and dill still hanging in the room. Patricia folded her napkin carefully. "David," she said, "I'm in a small situation with the roof repairs." Margaret touched my arm under the table. The estimate was $6,480 from Atlantic Roofing Specialists. Insurance wouldn't cover it. "We'll manage it," Margaret told her. I wrote the check 2 days later. Patricia promised to repay it once things settled. They never did. The second request came years later, Friday, September 18, 2009, at 11:10 a.m. Patricia called while I was reviewing irregular mortgage files at Halifax Dominion Credit Union. Her voice sounded tight. "It's Daniel," she said. "Your brother-in-law's business is collapsing." The amount that time was $12,750. Bridge financing, she called it. Temporary. Margaret believed her. "Family helps family," Margaret told me that evening while folding laundry. The warm cotton smelled faintly of fabric softener. I transferred the funds. Again, repayment never came. The third sacrifice happened on Sunday, May 7, 2017, at 3:30 p.m., during Emily's 10th birthday gathering in Patricia's backyard. The air carried the scent of charcoal and cut grass. Patricia pulled me aside near the fence. She had a habit I'd begun noticing by then, her eyes drifting past people while they spoke, scanning the room for someone more useful. "This one's delicate," she said quietly. "Medical bills. A private procedure not covered by provincial insurance." The amount was $18,770. Margaret squeezed my hand later that evening. "We can help, David. We're comfortable." And she was right. But I remember one small moment of hesitation as I logged the transfer that night. The numbers aligned too neatly with the previous requests. Patterns matter in my line of work. Still, I ignored the thought. Patricia, to her credit, always sent thank-you notes. Handwritten. Careful cursive. She never forgot Emily's birthdays either. She wasn't cruel. Not then. But here's what I didn't know then. Patricia Delaney had been quietly building her own ledger. And in her version of the math, those gifts would one day become a $38,000 debt I supposedly owed her. Funerals move in slow, deliberate rhythms. People speak softly, hands rest briefly on shoulders, and the air carries the heavy sweetness of flowers that will begin to wilt before the day ends. By 2:25 p.m. on Thursday, November 14th, the service for Margaret had concluded at Snow's funeral home. Chairs scraped gently across the chapel floor as guests stood to leave. Outside, the wind coming off the harbour rattled the bare branches against the windows. I remember the faint scent of lilies and polished wood. My colleague Raj Mehta leaned toward me near the aisle. "David," he whispered, "take a few minutes before greeting everyone. You don't need to rush." I nodded. Across the room, Patricia Delaney stood beside the guestbook table, that same leather folder tucked beneath her arm. She watched the room carefully, not grieving exactly, but assessing. A few minutes later she approached me again. Her voice carried farther than necessary. "David, before everyone leaves," she said, "we should settle the matter of the $38,000 family debt." A couple standing near the door paused. I saw Linda Caldwell, Margaret's cousin, lower her eyes. "Patricia," I replied quietly, "this isn't the time." Her lips pressed thin. "You borrowed money over the years," she said. "Margaret told me everything. The roof repairs. Daniel's business. Medical expenses." My hands tightened slightly around the program card I was holding. The paper bent beneath my thumb. "That money came from Margaret and me," I said. She opened the folder and removed several stapled pages. "Margaret intended for it to be repaid to the family," Patricia said evenly. "And since she's gone, the responsibility falls to you." The ice in someone's glass clinked sharply at the refreshment table behind us. I felt the dryness in my throat but kept my voice steady. "If Margaret intended that," I said, "I would know." Patricia tilted her head. "Perhaps you didn't listen closely enough." For a moment no one spoke. Even the quiet organ music had stopped. Then I noticed something that stayed with me long after the room emptied. Emily, standing near the coat rack, was watching us. Her small hand gripped the stuffed fox Margaret had given her. "Grandpa," she asked softly when Patricia stepped away, "why is great-grandma talking about money today?" I crouched beside her and adjusted the scarf around her neck. "Sometimes people forget what matters most," I told her. Outside, the wind had grown colder, and as Patricia walked toward the exit with her folder tucked neatly under her arm, I realized something unsettling. She hadn't spoken like someone asking for money. She had spoken like someone presenting a claim. But I didn't know yet what I was about to find. Grief leaves strange pockets of silence in a house. 3 days after the funeral, Sunday, November 17th, at 8:10 p.m., I was sitting at the dining table on Chestnut Street in the Hydrostone district of Halifax. The radiator clicked softly in the corner, pushing out that dry winter heat Margaret used to complain about. Margaret's laptop sat open in front of me. I wasn't searching for evidence. Not yet. I was simply trying to finish the administrative details that come after death: bank notifications, insurance confirmations, pension paperwork. Routine work. But forensic auditing trains your eyes in certain ways. Small irregularities stand out like ink stains on white paper. The first one appeared inside Margaret's archived email folder. An email from March 3, 2017. Sender, Patricia Delaney. Subject line, "Just so we're clear about the arrangement." The message was short. "Margaret, thank you for confirming the $18,770 transfer. I'll make sure David understands this is part of the family repayment plan later." I read the line twice. Family repayment plan? Margaret had never mentioned such a thing. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The lemon cleaner Margaret used still lingered on the kitchen counter. One message alone proves nothing. But patterns tell stories. First discovery, suspicious but explainable. On Tuesday, November 19th, at 10:15 a.m., I visited Halifax Dominion Credit Union to review our archived transfer records. My former colleague Raj Mehta met me in one of the consultation rooms. Raj adjusted his glasses and scrolled through the screen. "You're looking for transfers to Patricia Delaney?" he asked. "Yes." Raj nodded slowly. "I see 3. The numbers appeared in sequence. $6,480, March 14th, 2001. $12,750, September 21st, 2009. $18,770, May 8th, 2017. Total, $38,000 exactly. Raj whistled softly. "That's precise." I felt a quiet chill in the room despite the heating vents. "But here's the strange part," Raj continued. He turned the screen toward me. Each transfer memo field contained the same phrase. Family assistance, no repayment required. Margaret had typed that herself. Second discovery, deliberate pattern. The following week, Monday, November 25th, at 2:05 p.m., I scheduled a consultation with Palmer and Associates, the estate lawyers Margaret had quietly retained in 2019. Her lawyer, Elaine Porter, reviewed the documents carefully. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, tapping a printed email, "this wording suggests Patricia intended to reinterpret these gifts later." I nodded. "For what purpose?" Elaine opened another folder. "Because 2 months ago, September 6, 2025, Patricia submitted a written statement claiming you borrowed $38,000 from her daughter over several years." I felt the quiet precision of the scheme settling into place. Patricia hadn't invented the number. She had reconstructed it. Third discovery, the full betrayal. Then Elaine slid one final document across the table. "Margaret anticipated this," she said. Inside the envelope was a notarized letter Margaret had signed on August 28, 2025, at 4:20 p.m. inside Halifax Notary Services. Her handwriting was steady despite the illness. If my mother ever attempts to claim David owes her money, the attached documents show the transfers were gifts made jointly by us. My mother has struggled with debt for years, and I fear she may attempt to recover money from David after I'm gone. I read the final line slowly. David has always been generous. That generosity must not be used against him. I folded the letter carefully. Across the table, Elaine Porter watched me with quiet understanding. "Your wife prepared for this," she said. I nodded. But here's what Patricia Delaney didn't know. Margaret hadn't left just a letter. She had left instructions. And in exactly 60 days, one sealed envelope would turn Patricia's claim into something far more serious than a family dispute. I did not confront Patricia Delaney immediately. That might surprise some people, but patience is a professional habit when you spend 42 years tracing financial irregularities. You never confront a discrepancy before the records are complete. Instead, I followed Format B, institutional action first. On Thursday, December 5th, at 10 a.m., I returned to Palmer & Associates, where Margaret's estate file was stored. The office windows looked out across the grey winter harbour of Halifax, the water moving slowly under a low-cloud ceiling. The room smelled faintly of printer toner and brewed coffee. Across the table sat Elaine Porter, Margaret's estate attorney. "David," she said calmly, sliding a document across the desk, "your mother-in-law filed a civil claim on November 18th requesting repayment of $38,000 plus $4,260 in claimed interest." I studied the numbers. Precise. Calculated. "She believes the transfers were loans," Elaine continued. "They were gifts," I said quietly. Elaine nodded. "Yes." And Margaret anticipated this situation. The next steps were simple, procedural, and entirely legal. First, Patricia's claim was formally contested. Second, all correspondence was redirected through the estate office. Third, Margaret's notarized statement was filed as sworn evidence. And finally, Elaine scheduled a formal review meeting exactly 60 days after the funeral, as Margaret's written instructions required. That meeting would take place on Tuesday, January 14th, at 9:30 a.m. 2 days later, Patricia called me. It was Saturday evening, December 7th, at 6:42 p.m. The wind outside rattled the kitchen window while I washed a teacup. Her voice came through the phone sharp and controlled. "David, I received a letter from your lawyer." "I expected you might," I said. "You're contesting the debt." "I am." There was a pause. "You know Margaret promised repayment," Patricia insisted. "No," I said quietly. "She did not." Her tone shifted, denial becoming justification. "I raised her alone," Patricia said. "You have no idea what I sacrificed for that girl." "I believe you did," I replied. Another pause. Then the bargaining began. "Look," she said, softening slightly, "we can settle this privately. Send $25,000, and I'll withdraw the claim." I dried my hands slowly on the kitchen towel Margaret had embroidered years earlier. "Patricia," I said carefully, "the review meeting is January 14th. You're welcome to attend." Her voice hardened again. "You're making a mistake." That was when I delivered the only sentence that mattered. "I don't argue with accusations," I told her quietly. "I audit them." The line went silent for several seconds. Then Patricia hung up. I placed the phone back on the counter and looked toward Margaret's empty chair at the kitchen table. But here's what Patricia still didn't know. The envelope Margaret had sealed for January 14th did not simply defend me. It documented every financial transfer Patricia had ever requested from us since 1998. And when that envelope opened, the numbers inside would change the entire conversation. The morning of Tuesday, January 14th arrived colder than most Halifax winters. At 9:18 a.m., I stepped into the conference room at Palmer & Associates, where the estate review meeting had been scheduled. The window overlooked the grey harbour of Halifax, where thin sheets of ice moved slowly along the surface. The room smelled faintly of fresh paper and brewed coffee. At the far end of the table sat Patricia Delaney, her posture upright, hands folded carefully over the same leather folder she had carried to Margaret's funeral. Beside me, estate attorney Elaine Porter arranged several documents into neat stacks. "Thank you all for attending," she said calmly. "We're here to review the financial claim submitted by Mrs. Patricia Delaney regarding the alleged $38,000 loan." Patricia nodded confidently. "Yes," she said. "My daughter confirmed the arrangement several times." Elaine reached for a large cream-colored envelope resting at the center of the table. "This," she said, "is the sealed document Margaret Whittaker asked us to open exactly 60 days after her funeral." The room grew quiet. Elaine broke the seal. Paper slid softly against the table as she unfolded the contents. Inside were 3 things. First, Margaret's notarized statement, confirming the transfers were gifts. Second, a full financial ledger Margaret had compiled over 27 years. Elaine slid the ledger across the table toward Patricia. "Mrs. Delaney," she said, "these records document every request for financial assistance made by you or your son since February 1998. Patricia frowned. "That's irrelevant." Elaine shook her head gently. I'm afraid it's very relevant. She turned the final page. At the bottom was a total. $94,630. The room fell silent. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder. These are funds Margaret and David provided without expectation of repayment, Elaine continued. However, Margaret included a conditional clause. Patricia's face had begun to pale. What clause? She asked. Elaine read directly from Margaret's letter. If my mother ever attempts to recover money from David under false pretenses, I authorize the estate to present this ledger as evidence of financial manipulation and pursue recovery through civil action. Patricia's hands tightened around the edge of the table. You can't be serious, she whispered. I'm entirely serious, Elaine replied calmly. Then she placed the final document in front of her. A prepared legal filing. Should you proceed with the false debt claim, Elaine continued, the estate is authorized to pursue reimbursement of the $94,630 plus legal costs. For a moment no one spoke. Patricia stared at the numbers. Across the table, I said nothing. That silence lasted nearly 15 seconds. Then Patricia slowly closed her folder. I'll withdraw the claim, she said quietly. No anger. No shouting. Just arithmetic. As the meeting ended, I stepped into the hallway where my granddaughter Emily Whitaker waited beside Raj Mehta, who had agreed to bring her from school. Emily looked up at me. Grandpa, she asked softly, did the meeting go okay? I smiled. Yes, I said. How? I thought of Margaret's careful handwriting inside that envelope. Grandma left very good instructions. Justice rarely feels dramatic in real life. More often, it feels like quiet paperwork being filed in the correct drawer. By Friday, January 24th, at 11:15 a.m., the civil claim Patricia Delaney filed for $38,000 plus $4,260 in interest had been officially withdrawn through Nova Scotia Supreme Court. No courtroom arguments. No headlines. Just a short legal notice confirming the matter had been resolved. Elaine Porter emailed me the confirmation that afternoon. Subject line, claim withdrawn. Sometimes the most powerful outcomes arrive in a single sentence. Patricia never contacted me again about money, but the consequences of that meeting quietly rearranged several things in our family ledger. First, the estate maintained full control of the financial accounts Margaret and I had built together since 1994. Our joint investment portfolio, valued at $612,480.73 on the day Elaine finalized the estate inventory, remained untouched. Second, the ledger Margaret prepared ensured something important. No future claims could reinterpret those past gifts as debts. And third, Patricia understood that any attempt to pursue repayment would reopen the $94,630 documentation. Even Patricia Delaney knew better than to argue with numbers twice. Still, the strangest adjustment wasn't legal. It was personal. For several weeks after the meeting, the house on Chestnut Street remained painfully quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The radiator ticked. Margaret's favorite tea tin still sat near the stove, faintly smelling of bergamot. One afternoon in early February, Tuesday, February 11th, around 4:20 p.m., someone knocked on the front door. It was my sister-in-law, Caroline Delaney, Patricia's younger daughter. She stood on the porch clutching a small bakery box from 2 by Sea Cafe. I brought lemon squares, she said quietly. Margaret used to love these. We sat at the kitchen table together while the late winter sunlight stretched across the floorboards. I'm sorry about everything, Caroline said after a while. Mom, she gets scared about money. I nodded. Fear can make people rearrange their morals. Caroline looked down at the table. I'm not asking for anything, she added. I know, I said. And for the first time since Margaret's funeral, the house felt slightly less silent. These days my routine is simple again. Morning coffee at 7:15 a.m., a short walk through the Hydrostone Market, and sometimes picking up Emily from school when my son runs late. Peace, I've learned, isn't the absence of conflict. It's the quiet knowledge that the truth has already balanced the books. If you're listening to this story right now, there's a good chance something in it feels familiar. Maybe you've spent decades helping the people you love. Maybe you've written the quiet checks no one else saw, picked up the phone when family needed something, or carried responsibilities that were never officially yours. And maybe, at some point, someone treated that generosity as an obligation. I understand that feeling more than I once expected to. I'm 67 years old, living in the same quiet corner of Halifax, and most mornings I still make coffee at 7:15 a.m., just like Margaret and I did for 42 years. The house is quieter now, but it isn't empty. Emily still visits. Sometimes Caroline drops by with pastries. Life keeps moving, the way the Atlantic tide moves whether anyone is watching or not. But here's something age and experience eventually teaches you. Generosity is not weakness. It's simply trust extended in good faith. The mistake many of us make isn't helping people. The mistake is believing that help must continue forever, even when someone begins to rewrite the past to suit themselves. You're allowed to stop that. You're allowed to protect the life you built. You're allowed to examine the ledger. In my profession as a forensic auditor, I spent 42 years looking at financial records. Columns of numbers, dates, transfers, little details that reveal the real story underneath the surface. Families are surprisingly similar. Every act of kindness, every moment of loyalty, every broken promise, they all leave entries somewhere in the ledger of memory. And eventually, the books balance themselves. Sometimes quietly, sometimes 60 days later, inside a sealed envelope. If you ever find yourself in a moment where someone tries to make you feel guilty for protecting what you've built, remember this. You don't owe anyone access to your peace simply because they share your last name. Protect your boundaries. Document the truth. And never forget the simplest rule I ever learned reviewing financial records. The numbers don't lie, but people sometimes do. So if you're watching this and wondering whether it's okay to draw a line with someone who has taken advantage of your generosity, I'll tell you what I eventually learned. You have that right. You have that permission. Because the people who truly love you will respect the limits you set. The ones who don't, they were never yours to begin with.